We are online, so you can start.
Okay, thank you very much for coming back today. Um, the title of the paper and the evolution of languages from an ecological perspective. Why did I create this ambiguity? Because this is a central question. It, the large number of languages that we speak today ultimately descend from one proto-language, or did several primordial languages develop at more or less the same time? And that's a question that we have to answer at some point. It's summed up as monogenesis versus polygenesis. Monogenesis, one single origin, ultimate origin for all the languages that are spoken today and other languages that are there already. And polygenesis, we don't really know how many primordial languages emerged about 300 to 230 years ago, or maybe 300 to 100 thousand years ago. This is something that we have to pay attention to, and there are reasons for going one way or another, except that monogenesis sounds too biblical. And the reason is a lot of early scholars on the evolution of language since antiquity, especially during the Roman Empire. A lot of these scholars, philosophers, were also priests and Catholics. And it has not been easy to move away from that. Okay. And when you put it as language evolution, the question really doesn't arise in the same way as I have formulated it here. Now, if you can change. I'm going to ask you a question. The illustration of the evolution of mankind here, or of humans, has problems. Can you tell me what problems? When you look at the graphic representation of the evolution of mankind, there are some troubling questions that arise from there. One is that the evolution is representing as if the human population is whitening. Like black people are the most ancestral human specimen, and then we are all progressing towards whiteness. If evolution is really proceeding that way, then we are on a dangerous track. And there is no evidence for thinking that things are going this way, no more than we have any evidence for assuming that the early specimens, our earliest ancestors, when we go to the stage where we were like primates, non-human primates, that they were darker. Okay. And what is the second question? This representation, the second issue is this representation is very male chauvinistic. It all proceeded through males. It reminds you of the Bible again. God created Adam first and then created Eve out of the ribs or whatever of Adam. And that is really not really the way to go. Okay? And if we look at how we procreate, we have to mate, and it wouldn't have worked if it were only males. nor would it have worked if it had been only for females. Okay. And eventually we can say every human being is a hybrid of some sort out of the combinations of different gene pools or genes from different pools. And that is one of the ways in which we have to explain evolution. We create variation all the time, and in the Darwinian framework that has become even prevalent, evolution proceeds by competition and selection within specific ecological conditions. And the same is ecology rolls the dice. So I may have to come back on that later on. The next thing is that when we talk about language evolution, the emergence of language in mankind, we have to resist the temptation that humans were really thinking and planning how to develop language. Okay. And you see the cartoon here, the legend says, we'll start out by speaking in simple declarative sentences. If people could have said that at the time when they were inventing language, then they didn't need to invent any language because they already had a language. Okay. And the challenge really is how we humans as a species proceeded from where there was nothing we could call language to something that we could call language. And how we proceeded from the knowledge starting point to where we have such a high diversity of languages, and now we count about 7,000 of them around the world. So these are some of the questions that we have to address. And then we also know that a whole lot depends on our anatomy, because we look at the non-human primates, especially chimps, and it's debatable whether they could speak or sign with the kinds of anatomies that they have. And some people say yes, they could, but then we have to ask whether they have the right kind of mental infrastructure in terms of brain architecture in order to be able to produce language. And we're going to deal with that kind of question. So here we have two representations of Homo habilis, an ancestor that emerged about 2,500,000 years ago, and Homo erectus, an ancestor that emerged about 1,500,000 years ago. I don't know how accurate these representations are, but if you think hard enough, you must have come across a modern human being that looks either like Homo habilis or as Homo erectus. That's at least the structure, the neck, and the face. Okay. But at that time, we don't think that either Homo habilis was able of speaking or signing, or Homo erectus was capable of speaking or signing. And the question that we have to ask is whether these two ancestors had brains like ours, or whether they had different kinds of brains. And studies in paleoneurology suggest that they didn't have the kind of brains that we do. Therefore, even if the anatomies could have supported speech, they wouldn't have been able to develop languages. And at some point, we also have to make a distinction between speech, which is the tool that we use to produce language, versus language itself. So these are the kinds of details that we have to pay attention to. And here, on this slide, on the left, you have a graphic representation of the differential structure of the non-human primate, and on the right you have that of the human primate. And one of the things that we can think about is the length of the tongue and how it is positioned by the end of the mouth. And there's a difference. And also, what we also notice is that the larynx is rather high in the non-human primate. It's like where it is for the baby, a human baby that cannot speak. And here we have a larynx that is lower. We speak of the descent of the larynx. And it creates a curved, funnel-shaped decopharyngeal cavity. And that can make a whole lot of difference about how we produce speech. I'm not going to talk much about signing. You know, signing may have evolved emerged around the same time, but we don't really, there hasn't been much written about there, and I'm not a specialist in sign language, and I'm not going to speculate beyond what I can tell you later on as we move on in this lecture. But these are the kinds of details that anybody working on the phylogenetic emergence of language from non-language to language should be paying attention. And so, conventionally, we have assumed that things may have started just about 500,000 years ago when we became capable of producing phonetic sounds. Okay. And when I speak, or we speak of the phylogenetic emergence of language, this does not mean that there was no communication before that. We have always communicated since the very beginning, since we became social beings. Why? Well, we have to look at all other animals, they communicate. Except that they don't use what we call language, they have their own means of communication. And we must have that means of communication other than language, okay, in order to convey information to each other. The question is how precise, I cannot speak of precise communication because if languages were that precise, they would be very hard for us to learn. Languages are not that precise, but languages are expressive enough to be able to make it possible for us to talk about the present, the past, and the future. And other means of communication cannot really tell that. We have body language that shows whether you like a person or don't like a person, whether you are giving them messages to come close to you or not, but you cannot tell them tomorrow we are going hunting, or you cannot tell them yesterday I went to the beach. You cannot say that in sign language. You cannot say that really in gestures. And these are limitations, and we have to overcome those limitations at some point in our lives when our cultures were becoming cultures and knowledge were becoming increasingly more complex, and we needed to share information about our natural environment. We needed to share information about our social organizations, we needed to share information about things we were planning to do together. We needed to share information about whether or not we could be uh, part of the party going to hunt, or whether we were not feeling well enough and should stay home, and who was going to look after the children if we went hunting, and things of this sort. The organization really depends so much on the kinds of language that we develop. On the other hand, there were a number of things that we did before anyway, like you are working on an arrow and somebody is watching you and you could coach them about how to make an arrow, but not by giving explicit information as we can do now with language, but for instance by holding their hand and showing them how to move your knife aside in order to shape the arrow, or how to put a string in order to put the head of the arrow against the stick and things like that. That didn't probably need that much explicit communication. But at some point, if you have to teach somebody how to make a fire, maybe it was not too difficult. But if you have to tell somebody, give somebody instructions about where to go and where to find the right pieces of wood and where to find the right strings to tie pieces together and things like that, then we are facing challenges and somehow we have to overcome, we have to find solutions to those particular challenges. And did anybody really sit down and say, okay, I think we have to develop nouns first and then we're going to develop verbs? Or was there really a distinction between nouns and verbs and things like that? Should the noun come first or the noun follow the verb? These are the kinds of things that we really didn't plan. And what is interesting is that we wind up with languages that work in so many different ways, where in some of them it's the noun first, and the noun must be a subject, and then it is a verb, and then the following noun must be an object. In some other languages, you get the noun first, and then the subject first, and then the object first, and the verb comes last. And wait a minute, things become even more complicated. Things, some languages start with the verb, and then you get the nouns, two nouns following. But what goes inside the noun? Do you need an article or not? If you have an article, should the article come first or should the article follow? Things vary from one language to another. Wait a minute, you have to ask whether what is called an article in one language must also be called an article in another language. This may not be the case at all. There is a kind of variation. It's like with material technologies that we develop today, and I'm going to show you illustrations. The material technologies need and be designed exactly the same way. Okay. So, and we have interesting cases. You look at the non-human primates. They are the closest animals to us in many ways. And yet they cannot reproduce utterances that we produce, even when they live with us. We domesticate them and live with us in the same home. They are not going to speak, they are not going to sing. And yet, these animals, sometimes they want to let you know something. And they have to devise some way of getting the message to you if you pay attention. Okay. I live with a small dog, and this dog has caused me to ask myself a number of questions. The dog really wants my attention. And the dog cannot say daddy, daddy, or whatever. And the dog will come to me and scratch me and get my attention. or I want to hold the dog and the dog tells me not now, and she signals it to me if I pay attention because she moves back. She's small, she knows I can carry her. In this case, I'm doing violence to her if she doesn't want to be carried, but I carry her nonetheless. But she signals to me that that is not what she wants. Okay. So animals have ways of solving communication problems too, except that they cannot do it the way we do, and that is the challenge that we also have to explain. Okay. Is it because the body anatomy of the dog is so different? The monkey has an anatomy similar to ours, but cannot do it either. Is it because the brain structure is the same? But uh, the differences between the brain structure of the chimp and that of and our brain structure is small compared to the difference between the brain structure of my dog and me and mine. So the world just is so diverse, and when you pay attention, when we speak, we combine sounds together. And guess what other creature does that? Some birds do that when they produce songs. They can sequence these different notes, melodies next to each other. And according to experts, they have some sort of syntax like we do in our spoken languages, except that the syntax is not just like is not like ours, but it serves the needs very well. Okay. And communication must be assessed relative to the needs of the people who produce a particular language. And the other thing that one thing that this illustration here is showing is that the parrot is capable of mimicking human speech. They can repeat utterances. There are parrots that have got people in trouble for repeating the wrong thing. Okay. Like reporting that at a particular show, the woman is watching a particular play and then says, I love you. And then one day the husband is watching the same show and the same player comes home and then the parrot also says, I love you. And then the husband becomes suspicious and wants to find out where this came from and discovers that his wife is the lover of the player. So these are the kinds of things that can happen. But did the parrot really want to compromise the woman? Or did the parrot not understand what was going on and was just very good at mimicking speech? If the parrot was really capable of communicating linguistically and verbally, why did the parrot not develop their own spoken language when in the wild? That has not happened. And so things become complicated. And then you think of the anatomy of the parrot in producing speech. The parrot doesn't have a tongue like ours. The parrot doesn't have teeth. Actually, the pharyngeal structure of the parrot is not composed like ours. The parrot doesn't have a larynx where we produce voice, but instead it has a syrinx that is at the bottom of the throat, not in the middle of the throat. And these are interesting observations. And so the question is, if we had our kind of mind the way it is, but we didn't have the same kind of anatomical structure, would we have been able to produce language? And the answer must be yes. For one thing, deaf people have produced languages that are just as complex as spoken languages, and we call them sign languages. Okay. But the question becomes even more interesting. Why didn't deaf people resort to using legs to produce sign language? Or as I was a child, we were speculating that people could use their armpits to talk. Our parents used to tell us, don't go to the forest alone because there are creatures there and they look like humans, but they aren't, and they don't speak with their mouths, they speak with their armpits. And we spent a lot of time trying to play with our armpits, and nothing ever came, and we wondered, how come? Okay. So, and we know there are creatures that communicate by scent, but we humans, I mean, scent can be lexical of some situations, but we cannot use scent deliberately to communicate. And when we use language with deliberate behavior, okay, why didn't we go that way? And so forth and so forth. And one time I was giving this kind of lecture to an audience that didn't consist of linguists. And then I said, it's quite interesting that we never chose of speaking with our legs, but we can, I mean, of signing with our legs, we can sign with our hands. And I think because hands are more flexible. And one thing that I didn't think about is this man said, well, we are upright, okay? And our eyes are above at the top. And we don't necessarily look down when we move around, when we communicate with people. We look at their eyes and so forth. And therefore, it would have been inefficient to use legs. And I was thinking, well, we would have to be acrobats in order to use legs jumping all the time. And it probably would be very tiring. In other words, there are several ecological considerations to take into account why some options were just avoided and not taken into account. And the bottom line is we have a brain that is hard at work thinking and solving problems, not just for communication, but also about how to do things. And my suggestion is the brain got in command, the brain domesticated the anatomy, we speak of co-option, and specific anatomies, and thought of ways of producing language. And one of these things that the brain did first is that if we have to communicate by speaking oral, then we have to control our breathing. We don't breathe the same way when we speak as when we are not speaking. When we speak, we have to inflate our lungs very quickly and release the air slowly, but be able to suck in some air before we run out of air, because if we run out of air, we cannot speak anymore. Okay, and that's something. And then domesticate our mastication organs. We use the same organs for masticating food as for speaking. We use the teeth, we use the tongue, we use the lips. Okay. And the motions are more or less the same. The position of the tongue when we say sounds such as good, fillers, is about the position the tongue must assume in order to push the food down the throat. Okay? We use the tip of the tongue for some sounds. We clear the mouth with the tip of the tongue too when we eat, and things like this. We pay attention. It's really interesting. And something that made it so evident to me is, I think I was traveling here in Brazil. I went to Sao Paulo, And I had just visited my dentist in Chicago before I left, and he had cut my tongue, made a cut on my tongue, and under anesthesia I couldn't feel it. When I arrived in Sao Paulo and people took me to a restaurant, I couldn't enjoy my meal because my tongue was painful when I moved it. So I realized to what extent I could move the tongue more or less the way I move the tongue when I speak, but when I'm eating, the same motions are involved and so forth, and you realize the kind of thing. So, the position I'm going to develop here is languages as technologies. Okay. Technologies are things invented to solve a problem. We often think of technologies as something material. This is the microphone here is technology, my phone there is technology. Okay. But when you think of language, it's also technology. You can have technology that is kind of abstract, but there is a physical side of this technology, how to produce sounds. The sounds themselves are not language. Okay. But using sounds in a special way so that you can convey messages, that you can convey information, that transforms the sounds into technology. Okay. But it's not the sounds alone, it's how you combine the sounds together that produce words, how you combine the words together in order to produce more information. And we wind up producing information that is more explicit than, like, say, gestures or body language, and we wind up producing technology that is high fidelity. High fidelity because even in a noisy environment, we still can recognize speech. So you must have been in settings where everybody is speaking around you. And speaking louder and louder is not always is not typically the solution because things become, if you get everybody speaks louder and louder, nobody hears nobody else. But if you tune out the people around you, then even if the other person doesn't shout, you can still understand what they are telling you. It's more difficult, but that is a sign of high fidelity. That the means that we use for communication, is it for this the means that we use for communication is such that it can offset the noise around us. And that way you can perceive. So the problem to solve it was establishing efficient communication between individuals living together, interacting with each other, realizing that they have a lot to gain from cooperating with each other, finding it necessary to share thoughts, feelings, and perspectives on their experiences, and thus to learn from each other. What is the payoff in doing this? We accumulate knowledge faster and we spread knowledge faster. That is very important. We could learn on our own, but we have limited experience. But our mind works in such a way that if you have experienced something that I haven't experienced, through language you can explain your experience to me and I build knowledge from there. This is actually what we do when we teach, right? What the speaker, what the instructor knows is imparted through language and then the students get it. With friends we do exactly the same thing. And collectively, we build knowledge faster. Vast amounts of information contained in populations. And not because everybody has had the same experience, but everybody can learn from somebody else's experience. And so forth. That was really a big payoff. And it has been a big payoff. And we have stuck to it. Okay. Then, if technology is there to help us solve problems, we have done it all along with language. The question is, how many steps did we go through in order to develop these languages? Okay. So languages are emergent and collective technologies evolving piecemeal or incrementally and without foresight. We add things, but without anticipation of the consequences of the things that we are adding. If they go wrong, we can repair them. But chances are that they have solved a problem today, they will solve the innovations will solve another problem tomorrow. And somebody else sees that I have solved a problem and they solve it. And nobody has the monopoly of solving all the communication problems for everybody. Everybody solves their problem when they are trying to communicate. If it works, other people will copy it. If it doesn't work, people will ignore it. Okay. And the same way that we explain how changes occur in the languages that we speak, we can also accept similar explanations for how languages were created. So piece by piece, incrementally, and what we wind up with a language that is so complex that if you have an assignment and somebody asks you to explain how your language works, you need years of thinking before you can come up with an account, and you may even fail because you cannot really get into the complexity of how things work. Okay. So these are technologies that arose by self-organization, while speakers and signers are focused on communicating in the hit and move here and now of the interaction. That is really what we do. Okay. And they learn from previous successful attempts at communicating. And there are no linguistic problems that we solve the same way. You try a solution, now you have a new task, or let me try something that I tried before, and it works. So it becomes part of your modus operandi, how you operate. And then the next time you try again, if it doesn't work, you say, well, maybe I should do something else here. We tinker, and then we produce these solutions, and they become part of our knowledge. And then you have a child, and you give them advice, and you tell them, this is what I do, try this. Okay, this is what I saw somebody do, try this, and so forth. And if we are democratic enough, you'll find out that it's not only the grown-ups that have this privilege. The children too can come up with ideas that work, and you learn from them. This is how we operate in society. Why did the languages emerge wholesale in a catastrophic kind of way? But that wouldn't be consistent with the evolution of mankind, because we proceeded from ancestors that were ape-like to other ancestors more evolved that were less and less ape-like, to where we can say our cousins, the non-human primates, but not really like our siblings. Okay. And that evolution was incremental. So, you can identify the emergence of Homo habilis, the tool man, or the tool making human, and then Homo erectus, the one that is bipedal and was erect, and Homo sapiens. Okay. And mutations occur at different stages that produce these new species, and we have survived, whereas the Neanderthal has not survived. We don't know what the human population would have been like if the Neanderthal had survived and we didn't survive, Homo sapiens. And so under these conditions, it's really difficult to imagine that a language would have emerged wholesale with all the ingredients in it without any transition. Besides, we don't have the same capabilities in learning, which means many people wouldn't have learned to speak. And that would have been a disaster for our societies. Okay. So the hominin anatomy was not always like the modern Homo sapiens. Okay. The mental structure and capacity of the hominins have been changing in a way similar to ontogenetic development from the infant to the adult stages of modern humans. So if you pay attention, you have a baby, the baby looks anatomically just like you, the parent, but the baby doesn't have control of their emotions yet. They cannot walk yet. You have to wait until they can crawl, and then after they crawl, how they can stand, and so forth. And you pay attention. It takes a while before the child could even utter meaningful sounds. But there are a number of things that happen that the child keeps eye contact with you. That at some point you can play games where you take turns with the child. You hum and you stop, and the child hums and stops, and then you hum and the child hums too until you both get tired. The game is over. But something is evident here. We have this capacity for turn taking, and this is very important in how we communicate with each other. You cannot both be speaking because nobody hears the other. So turn taking is important. So there is a so-called interactional instinct. Interaction instinct, a notion conceived of by Stephen Levinson, which must have evolved before we evolved the capacity to use language. Okay. And you look at the child, and then at some point, the child is trying to imitate human sounds, and the child goes through that. In other words, there is some sort of anatomical maturation that takes place, and the counterpart of that anatomical maturation in human phylogeny is certain things that Homo erectus could do that Homo habilis couldn't do. With the erect position, a number of changes happen in our anatomy, like what they call the flattening of the face. The flattening of the face is that, like you saw the illustration in non-human primates, the part of the mother nose is protruding hair. In humans, it's closer, just almost a straight line for many people. Okay. What's the consequence of that? The same tongue goes down the throat. So as it goes down the throat, it pushes the larynx down. The larynx used to be at the top of the throat, it goes to the middle of the throat. Now it shapes a different bucopharyngeal structure as you speak. That gives more room for you to play with your tongue, with the aperture of the mouth, to produce different kinds of sounds. Okay. And the child just learns that I think at about 10 months of age, 12 months of age, that larynx has some, and the child is capable of producing some sounds. But what you also notice, the child doesn't start with E, and this is the name of the game. The child is interested in naming things around. Okay. So one question that we have to ask when we talk about the evolution of language, is it the sounds that came first or names that came first? I use the term name here in the sense of label. So this is Nani, this is Mommy, this is Daddy, that is Andy, that is Lucy, and the child is trying to produce all these names. And you may not recognize the name that the child is trying to say, but little by little, the child sharpens the articulation. And the words become clearer and clearer and clearer. Okay. And by the time the child is about 20 months to 24 months, the child starts producing little bits of utterances. The experts say the communication is telegraphic. Okay. And by the time the child is 5 or 6, child can actually produce sentences, simple sentences, like the parents, and the child can be sent to school where the child is going to understand what the child is being told and so forth. I had a revelation. One day my daughter was quite argumentative, and I was walking her to school. And then I used a word that she didn't understand. And she asked me, what does that word mean? And I explained to her, and I wondered, how did she learn the verb mean? She must have heard us, her mother and me, use the verb mean, and she made sense of it. And at some point, as were having this conversation, and she just got us sick. She said, that's not fair, you are using words that I don't understand. Okay. So, in other words, there is in our interactions with children, there is a lot of influence going on. No parent really puts the child on their lap and says, hey, come, this is no longer playtime, this is language time. And we're going to have our class in your mother tongue. Then it doesn't happen that way. And actually, when you try to correct the child, very often the child thinks that you are misleading them and sticks to what they have learned. Okay. And if it is a mistake, they will correct the mistake in due time, but not at the time when you are correcting them. Okay. And this is an important aspect of the evolution of language. And things become more complicated, of course, because we are dealing with populations. And in a population, people are not all doing the same thing. And there are innovators and there are copiers. And one of the things that we have to learn through the process is that language transmission is not really vertical in the way that we have usually assumed from caregiver to children, but it is horizontal. There comes a point when children ignore their parents, like their parents don't speak well. They pay attention to the other kids that they are growing up with, and they are keeping up among themselves, and this is how things develop. And then they go to school, and then all of a sudden, the teacher is a better model than the parents. So otherwise, why would you send me to school if I could stay home and you just teach me everything? And so forth and so forth. And the children, they learn in very interesting ways. If you are an immigrant somewhere, if you pay attention, you are learning a whole lot of the local language from your child. I tell people I learned more English the moment I started raising a child speaking English. Because the child was coming back home with words and phrases that I never heard in my interactions with adults. And now she was bringing them home, the became part of my vocabulary too. Okay. So these are very interesting things to bear in mind. So communicative needs in the hominin line have not always been the same order of complexity. Okay. Nor did they all arise at the same time. So the communicative needs of Homo habilis were not exactly like the communicative needs of Homo erectus. And by the time of Homo sapiens, the communicative needs become more complex. And of course, Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens had different communicative needs from ours. And in Homo sapiens, we don't really know in what particular ways the brain has evolved. We know that from our brain was, and these neurologists, paleoneurologists are telling us this, that the structure of our brain is different from the structure of Homo erectus's brain. We have a thicker cortex, and we may have had a rewiring of the cortex to the base of the brain, which makes a whole lot of difference. So you can compare this to, say, the evolution of computers. Every time you change the chip, and this is more manifest in our telephones, we get so many editions of new telephones that the telephone company wants us to buy. This is very, you can do more with it. And what's the difference? The chip has been modified. And in unanticipated ways, you can do things, more things than what the chip was designed for. Okay. And we can think of our brains as having evolved in similar ways. And you also look around, what changed was not just our capacity to communicate, also our social organization changed. We started living in larger agglomerations. The need for organization within these agglomerations became more and more critical. We had to decide who was going to be the chief, what was the authority of the chief, what report to the chief, and whatever. But we had to also decide who can marry who and who cannot marry who. The laws of incest, which we don't find in other animals, okay? And so forth. The cultures become more and more complex, therefore the knowledge becomes also more and more complex, and therefore the communication needs become more and more complex. Yes. Naturally, you need more complex means of communication, and these are parts of the pressures that drove the evolution of language. The gradual emergence of language in mankind, not only from non-language to language, but also from languages with simpler architectures to languages that are so complex that if they ask you to develop a language, all of a sudden you would be able to develop one, even among experts. We haven't been able to teach computers to talk exactly like us either, because the task is monumental. It involves so many different properties. Okay, so the mind had to be in gear all the time, that the mind co-opting the anatomy, but not the same kind of mind in gear. Not even after the present human anatomical structure was formed already, about 500 to 200,000 years ago. The architecture of modern languages have evolved according to the materials used and the complexity of the problems to solve. We must bear in mind that at different stages it was more cost effective to co-opt or adapt what was in place than to redesign something more adequate from scratch. A colleague of mine, William Gimser, came up with the notion of generative enforcement. And this example, you look for instance at the design of the computer. Much of the design is the technology that was developed in the early 20th century. Still, that system in machine language was 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, and how you put them together. I don't know how to get into those details. And then you build things up by tinkering on top of each other. That's why we have to deal with bugs after, a new generation of software has been put on the market. A number of you that are PC people probably remember when the La Vista program was introduced and it couldn't work and people had to abandon it. Otherwise, most of the time, you just have to build it on a program that already exists, and then you build it on a program that already exists, and you solve bugs. Okay? And if the system really collapses, then you are lost because you don't know where the problem originated. Because nobody really said, the system is becoming more complex. Let's redesign a new one from scratch. Look at the time that you would lose in trying to redesign one from scratch. But if you keep thinking, you can just make these adaptations and then you move on and so forth. And quite the same thing with language too, more or less. Okay. So more cost effective to co-opt or exact, that's the technical term, and what is already in place than to redesign something from scratch. The choice between domestication of the self versus using external materials. We had the choice. We didn't have to domesticate ourselves. We could have used, like we speak of drum, communication through drums. Okay. But you would have to carry the drum with you everywhere you went. Right? And when you move, we are migrant populations, we have a lot to carry. There's food you want to carry, there's a child you want to carry, and so forth. If you must add a drum, it becomes too much. So these are the kinds of ecological pressure that were in place. Right? So it's cheaper to just use your own body as the technology to produce language, and the transportation cost is zero. Right? And the choice between vocal and manual technology, this is also important. So the question is, why didn't we all become silent? Because when we capitalize on spoken language, we are actually discriminating against deaf people. And when we tell them you have to read languages, there's really being brutal, doing violence to them, and not giving them the latitude to use manual communication. And think about it, when you are underwater, it would be stupid to try to speak, right? But you think about it, how much time do we spend underwater after all? So that's a minimum cost in terms of our survival. Okay. And you have to protect yourself in the forest, and you are near a predator. Guess what happens when you speak? You give away your location, right? And you are likely to be attacked by the predator, especially if it is a large animal. So you are better off signing. But there's a problem of visibility too in the forest that is not solved. So the choices were not perfect. But this is where philosophers say we go for a satisficing solution rather than a satisfactory solution. Okay. Satisficing it will solve our problem most of the time, but not all the time. And then you compare these different means, well, you gain more from one technology than from another. Sure enough, you can communicate all your thoughts in signing too. But when it comes to working and manual work, either you use your hands to work or you use your hands to sign. You cannot do both at the same time. But you can speak and do work with your hands at the same time. So it's a matter of advantages. Okay, that can explain why most human populations, or most people around the world, have gone for speaking rather than signing. But the people that are deaf and cannot hear speech, although they are endowed with the same anatomical organs, they have to go for signing. Okay, and that works. So this underscores my emphasis on ecology. These are all ecological constraints. And the question is if there were other considerable materials for communication technology, and I gave the example of the drum. Yes, but look at the cost of using the drum as part of the communication technology. Scent, how many different scents can we produce deliberately? Okay, why can ants communicate by scent? Or why can bees communicate by scent? The other question is how many different kinds of things do they communicate by scent? You know, the things about which they have to communicate are really minimal compared to the things that we need to communicate with our languages and so forth. So scent was not an option. And you can consider many other alternatives that probably didn't work. Okay. Did people really spend time making the choices the way I articulated now? We really don't know. But there are certain alternatives that people just had to discard, didn't even have to consider because they would be practical. So how about sounds? Did we know that they would work as technology for communication? Well, is there a clear answer to this? People try. First of all mammals are vocal beings. They vocalize. Okay. And speaking of co-option, we co-opted our ability to vocalize in order to produce phonetic sounds. And somebody must have noticed that you could produce different kinds of vocalization by configuring your mouth the same way. And then little by little, the inventory of sound that we could produce kept increasing. And my explanation for this is that nobody really sat down to say how many different sounds can I produce. But the great pressure came from how many different things can I name. And as I name things, how can I modify the sounds so that I can name something else? So, pat, pick, pot, put, and so forth. Oh, pen, fun, and whatever I cannot think of others that I can produce. And then you realize it's not just one syllable, you can put several syllables together. Pin, pen, pen, pin. You produce different words. And you can change the consonants, you can change the vowels, and so forth. And you play. And I once wrote a phonetician and asked him, how many different sounds can a human being produce? And we said in abstraction of the 3,000 different sounds. But if you have 3,000 different sounds and you want to use all of them, perception, discriminating your perception becomes very challenging. P, 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 can you always tell the difference? So you have to avoid some. So most languages are within the range of 30 to 40 sounds. Some languages have fewer and some languages have a little bit more. I don't know of any language that has more than 100 different sounds. And you work well. If you have a limited number of sounds, but you can combine them in different ways, you'll be surprised how many different words you can produce. And if you factor in the number of syllables in a word, now you can explain why we can have over 1 million words in a language. If that is possible, how many of them would you remember? Only your dictionary can remember that many, but there is a certain fraction that you can really control and you can use and you can communicate. So, in other words, there are different kinds of ecological constraints that bore on how languages emerge in mankind and how we can use them and how we can transmit them. Okay. Maybe I should stop here for a break. Okay. there are so many times when you go out and people cannot really tell how many people have come back already
Yeah. But
when they are outside the room.
yes. But we can start?
Uh, we can
Yeah.
we can start.
Yeah.
Well, yes, people lose track of time, I hope. So the question, why is there typological variation? And is this consistent with monogenetic accounts of the emergence of language? It is a problem, especially if you associate the emergence of language with a dedicated language organ. If you are a generativist, there is a language organ, and it is the language organ that more or less dictates the ways in which um, languages are structured and how they can vary one from the other. But if you look at the emergence of language from the point of view of technology, you really wonder whether it was necessary to have a language organ at all. I mean, to posit a language organ at all. Or whether all you need is a non-purpose mind that can solve different kinds of problems. Like generativists talk about recursion as an essential property of languages. But is recursion limited to language? Or do you find recursion in the ways in which we solve other problems? For instance, if you have ever tried to buy furniture that comes in a box, and then you have to follow instructions to assemble the piece of furniture, you will notice quickly that you are applying recursion, that you have put a particular component together and then another component together, another component together, and then you have instructions about how to fit these components in larger frame, and you are proceeding in a hierarchical way to do this. Okay, so recursion is not an exclusive property of languages. Recursion seems to reflect how the mind works in solving problems, partially, and you go from smaller components to larger and larger components, or you come the other way around down in doing this kind of thing. So for this, you just need a non-purpose mind that can solve different kinds of problems. And there are certain things that follow principles dictated by the material that you are using in your technology. Um, for that, we can account for universals in different ways. So the typical way has been um, because of the language organ is responsible for what we call universals of language. But when you put things in perspective, you can also say it's not really the language organ, it's the way that the mind works. And because the same mind is involved, the same principles are used by the mind regardless of what material you are using. And the material may suggest what you can do and what you cannot do. If you are using sounds to produce language, you can produce only one sound at a time. And the sounds have to follow each other. And that accounts for linearity. And linearity is probably the most pervasive universal of spoken languages. However, when you are signing, you are not strictly bound by linearity. In signing, you can conflate a lot of information in one. For instance, if I want to say the snake slid fast up the tree, slither, how the snake moves. So the snake slithered fast up the tree. It takes so many words because I'm bound by the principle of linearity to first say the subject and then the verb and then the speed and then the direction, and then the body on which the direction is taking place. But if I'm signing, I'm going just to show you how it may work because I'm not a signer. The snake slithered fast up the tree. It's all packed together. We call this conflation. Slithered fast up the tree. I move my arm faster. I wiggle the arm at the same time, and at the same time my hand goes up. Okay, and that's why I say modality has its constraints that are imposed on the kind of language you develop. Okay, and we shouldn't expect sign language to be structured exactly like spoken language. If I say Bill loves Mary, I can, in speaking, I can only use one word at a time. It could be Bill Mary loves, or loves Bill Mary, depending on the language that I'm speaking, but there's a principle of linearity. In signing Bill Mary love, I don't have to organize things the same way. I may identify Bill and Mary and establish the relation of love, or I may say love and then position Bill and Mary. So things work differently. So these are some of the limits of universals. And we speak of typological variation. And the question is what kind of variation your modality allows and what kind of variation your modality will not allow. Okay. If we had to depend so much on the language organ, then we would go for the some ideal solution dictated by the language organ. Like, how many different sounds do I really need to develop a language that works well? And what are the constraints of the ways in which I can combine the sounds? There will be limitations too. And for the grammar, there will probably be less variation in grammar across the grammars than there is. And actually, you find all kinds of variation patterns across languages. And when you put things in perspective, think how we differ in the solutions to the solutions that we produce for non-linguistic problems. Okay. One thing that struck me, I travel a lot and I find variation in the way you flush the toilet. And you pay attention. Different places you have to pay attention where you have to pull and where the lever is that you have to pull, where it is on the top of the tank or on the side of the tank. And as I found out here in Brazil recently, there is something on the button on the wall that I have to press and really hard to get the toilet to flush. So different ways, and they all have more or less the same effect. But if you pay attention, some solutions are less effective than some other solutions. Okay, so there you go with variation. And the light switches, they vary so much from one place to another, the conventions are there. The basic idea is the same, but how you implement the idea varies from one thing to another. Now I'm going to go to things that are a little bit more mundane. You pay attention to how we greet each other. Only one time in life did I miss the hand of the other person I wanted to shake, whose hand I wanted to shake. But once you establish contact, feel the grip, Some people think that they have to put a tight grip on your hand while you are shaking hands. And some people just do it lightly. For some people, it's like you are too dirty, I'm going to remove my hand right away. And for some people, like they want to keep it, some people like they want to not only shake your hand, but the whole arm and yank your arm off your shoulder. So there's the kind of variation in the ways that we do things. And for languages too, it's the same. People settle on different practices in their own societies. Like if you have to make a distinction between the polite you and the colloquial you, different, that's two step in Spanish, the classical example of du versus sie in German. Uh, you get that kind of variation. And some populations even have elaborate honorific systems that they want to use, and some people think we don't need those kinds of things. Okay. So tomorrow I'll be talking about the cultural dimension of language evolution, and I'll come back to these kinds of things. So variation is simply a consequence of there being alternative um, technological responses to the same problem. If you are a teacher and you give a lot of assignments, you'll be surprised, well, or you shouldn't be surprised. Your students come up with alternative solutions to the same assignment. Yet you have been all using the same textbook, and you have had the same teacher explaining things to the class, and you give your assignment, and look how much variation there is in the answer that you get. Because as Cartesian as you may think we should be, our minds don't operate in identical ways. And the kinds of things to which we pay attention are not exactly identical from one person to another. Now you take the size of Africa as a big continent, and we have all been told that Africa is the cradle of mankind, and that this hypothesis of exodus out of Africa, the out of Africa hypothesis. And you think of places where there have been fossils of Homo sapiens. It used to be East Africa. Then it expanded to the whole area here. And now it has gone to North Africa where there are also fossils of early Homo sapiens. And some people have found some in West Africa. How likely is it that all these would be consequences of monogenesis, language emerging from one common ancestor, when people had still to travel on foot? It would have taken forever for some people to get language, and yet, more or less at the same time, it looks like there were languages emerging in these different places. So polygenesis becomes more likely. It's like at some point we were all smart enough to invent a calculator, but the solutions that we came, well, first of all, with mathematics. The solution that we came up with were not exactly identical. The Romans came up with a system of writing numbers, which is very cumbersome. And the Arabs came up with their system of writing numbers. So now the whole world follows the Arab way, because if you have to write 500 plus 1,000 plus 1 million in the Roman system, you would fill a page. But if you have to do it the Arab way, it takes you less space. And you find out that the Romans didn't have, they had a notion of absence, but they didn't have made zero part of the mathematics, and the Arabs did. Okay, so if you have zero and other 9 digits, you can write all sorts of numbers. Okay. For the Romans, if you had zeros, that meant you didn't have to count. But otherwise, you have different combinations of up to 10, and you can combine them up to 20. And by the time you get to 50, you come up with another kind of character. And you get to 100, you come up with another symbol. And then, but when you add them, you wind up with long streaks. In the Arab way, you do it differently. It's not that the Romans were not good mathematicians. Look what they built as monuments and constructions in architecture using the numbers. So, but in practical terms, you say, well, these are alternative ways of solving problems. We all, I mean, not all populations, some populations have invented writing systems, and the rest of us cut it from them. And you can develop a writing system that capitalizes on individual sounds, that's the alphabetical system. And you can develop a writing system that capitalizes on ideas, that the demographic system. You can also come up with a writing system that capitalizes on syllables, and that's different. And so, but we all communicate ideas in writing, but using alternative solutions. And you can go on and on and on. Okay? And you go to the car, you find a kind of variation, the same basic principles, but they are not implemented in identical ways. And sometimes you get competition with devices. And these are the kinds of things that we have to remember. And that's why there is also typological variation from one language to another. The question is whether there is really a principal way in which that variation obtains. Joseph Greenberg tried to deal with it in the 1960s, but I don't think that he captured everything. And generative research tried with parameter setting and so forth. It was a partial analysis that went nowhere. Okay. We still have quite a bit to learn about typological variation across languages. And so it looks like polygenesis is the way to go, but it depends on your religious faith, apparently, or the tradition in which you were trained. Okay. And according to the Bible, the book of Genesis, the Tower of Babel accounts for the multiplicity of languages in the world, and it was supposed to be a curse because God wanted to punish us so that we wouldn't communicate with each other, and so that we wouldn't build a tower that would come close to his abode in the sky or heaven. Why God would want to do that, we don't know, but I think that we have to think harder. The reason why we have all this is that if we return to Africa, languages certainly emerge. They will go back to the oldest, So the languages that emerged here didn't have to have properties identical with languages that emerged in those different parts. But because the mind of Homo sapiens was at that level of evolution where people in different places could think in similar ways and try to solve problems in similar ways, but there was still variation from one place to another, and variation not only in the vocabulary, but variation also in the way that you put the different words together in a sentence. Variation in the ways in which you package information into words and things like that, and that is part of reality. So now we can proceed forward. So, thank you. How likely are small populations inhabiting separate colonies, not in regular contact with each other, to have innovated languages at exactly the same time and all with the same structural features, beyond the use of phonetic and manual materials and the capacity to name and refer. Naming is like, this is the table, this is the microphone, there's Mary, there's Jane, there's Peter, and refer is like when I say put the book on the table, and I say the book but not book, and I say the table and not just table. So the table enables me to refer by using the label table, okay? And I could also say put the book on a table, in which case you are free to choose which table you have to put the book on, as opposed to the table, which means that you and I know which table I'm talking about. That's reference. Okay. Assuming monogenesis, how did typological variation emerge? If there was one uh, proto-language that all the other languages eventually evolved from, and that language didn't have variation, how would, and every person is assumed to learn their mother tongue well, even if they go in different directions, how can you explain variation? On the other hand, if you say separate languages in different places emerged, but they didn't have to have, those primordial languages didn't have to have identical structures, then we can easily account for typological variation. Or there is another way out if you assume homogeneity, that you have to think that like modern languages, the primordial language would have variation in it. And if it has variation in it and people disperse, the balance of power among the variants is no longer the same and things are going to evolve in different ways. Okay. So at that point, I would say there is a really much of a difference between monogenesis with built-in variation and uh, polygenesis. Okay. And these are the kinds of things that we can debate on, but these are some research avenues to follow. So what is the likelihood of monogenesis in the emergence of languages, and what does it mean when we speak of the polygenetic emergence and evolution of language, or language with a capital L to mean the abstract properties of languages that we use? What is the significance of the fact that all human languages are spoken or signed? I talked about that earlier. There must have been a number of other alternatives that were eliminated. Okay, move to the next slide. And here comes the dispersal out of Africa. People used to say between 50 and 30,000 years ago. Some people say it may have occurred much earlier, even 80,000 years ago. We really don't know. And the maps here shows with particular dates how the dispersal proceeded. But this was before genetics was well developed in the relation of in relation to not only our biological evolution but also our dispersal, because we can use genetics to determine which particular populations move in which direction and so forth. And if you use it, okay, I'll skip that. You get here to, for instance, the fragment of Indo-European history. When was there ever a group of Proto-Indo-Europeans? Or is it people that migrated from different areas and found themselves in parts of Europe and in parts of South Asia? And then, because they have similar features, this is what we call linguistic areas. And they share those features, and as they spread around again and colonized population, colonized territories where there were pre-Indo-European populations, they drove the other languages to extinction, and therefore we have this family. How can we explain for the diversification of Indo-Europeans, Indo-European languages? It's becoming complicated because before, can we go back now?
Yeah.
That two slides, and sorry, we have to go back up to the map. This one. Yeah. So here, what you find out, I drew both maps here for myself. This one represents the Bantu populations. And the Bantu populations about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago started migrating. And what we learn is that they really also responded to the natural ecology. They went around the rainforest. And then little by little they penetrated the rainforest. And in penetrating the rainforest or passing some mountains, they even colonized each other too. Okay. And then we go from one putative proto-Bantu to thousands of Bantu languages, or more than 1,000 Bantu languages. Okay. But when the Bantu went, there were also people speaking different languages, like the Pygmies and the Khoi and San populations. I'll show you another map in a while. And you cannot really explain the diversification of the Bantu languages and the birth of those. If they all spoke one language here, then theoretically the more than 1,000 languages that they speak consist of varieties that emerge later. Not only because they took possibly different variants to different places, but also because in mixing, in interacting with the different Pygmy and Khoi and some people, they got influenced by those languages. This is what you call substrate influence. So, like the Khoi and San languages have clicks, the other languages don't have clicks. The Bantu languages spoken in this area in the south also have clicks. Okay. But as the Bantu languages had already speciated when they came in contact with each other, what effect did they have on each other? Then we come to the case of Indo-Europeans. According to one hypothesis, the Proto-Indo-European was in Anatolia, where Turkey is today. And they split from there. But if you pay attention to the history of Europe since the Roman Empire, you get the impression that so-called Proto-Indo-Europeans didn't all disperse at the same time. And it's not sure that there was just one Proto-Indo-European that was taken everywhere. That there were already differences. And you get the impression too that the Celts preceded every other linguistic group, and they occupied a large part of Western Europe all the way to the British Isles. And then came the Romans, and they colonized a great deal of that world around the Mediterranean and so forth. But what we find out, we learn too, that the contact of Latin with Celtic languages produced the Romance languages. But we also learn from that history that the Germanic populations didn't really stay where they are, today. They kind of went north and came back south. That's what we learned about the collapse of the Roman Empire, that the Germanic populations were attacking from the north, and some have went around and attacked, like Spain, where we have the Visigoths. And at some point, the Muslims would colonize the same part, especially Iberia. And the Germanics, the Franks colonized Gaul, and the Germanics also went to England. And what we see is the emergence of these Romance languages. And the varieties in Gaul got influenced by Frankish. The varieties in Iberia got influenced by Arabic. And these are the kinds of things that we have to acknowledge. So it's a history of population movement and language contact and language change. Okay, so there's a whole lot to learn from this particular history. And then you just, it's like the questions that we can raise now in talking about this diversification are the kinds of questions that we have to raise about the idea of monogenesis versus polygenesis. And what's the usefulness of monogenesis, if it is useful at all. Okay. And that's where we have to say, hey, let's emancipate ourselves from Christianity when it comes to matters of language. I don't want to teach you religious heresies here. But in this particular case, from an intellectual level, we have to step back. And assuming monogenesis doesn't set you up against God, okay, then God could have made us in ways that these things would be arriving, occurring naturally like this. Now we go to the next map. And what is interesting here is this particular population here, Yamnaya, that is not Indo-European. And the dispersal of population from that area into South Asia, and the dispersal of population from that area to Europe. So it wouldn't be consistent with the maps of population dispersal out of Africa that I showed you much earlier. And you follow those kinds of maps, you get the idea that there was every time some sort of general saying, you, this group, you go here, and this group, you go there. And when you get there, you split. You get there. It couldn't have occurred that way. There are other things. You have to answer the question of why people were migrating in the first place. Why did we leave Africa? Why did we come back to Africa later? And where did we go? What were we looking for? These are interesting questions. They are ecologically relevant questions to ask about our dispersal around the world and about the diversification of languages. Okay. And the alternative here, you get the people coming to Anatolia from the Caucasus, people coming from South Asia to Anatolia. If this is correct, it tells you something about whether or not we have to believe in Proto-Indo-European. Or whether Proto-Indo-European is just a construct telling us that at some point there were languages that were related because of contacts, intense contacts between them. And then at some point when they diversified, they took variation with them, but in different ways. And that would explain partly why there are differences even among Indo-European languages. These are research questions. There are challenges that we have to face. And my hunch is that the idea of just one Proto-European language from which yeah, every other Indo-European language has ultimately emerged doesn't tell the full story. And you also realize that, as I said about Creoles, Creoles are telling us how language contact drove diversification and drove changes that are associated with the diversification. This is really the kind of thing we have to pay attention to. So let's move to the next map. Okay. So what you see here with the animation is that before the Bantu got in the region, there were the Pygmies here, there were the Khoi and San languages there in Southern Africa and East Africa. And then there we have um, Niger called the Fanyan, and where the Bantu would be coming from here, around the border of Nigeria and Cameroon, and dispersed from there, and eventually you get to where I think there's another part of the map that you have to click again. There's another part of the map. Yeah. So we get to where the whole area here in yellow becomes Bantu, and the Pygmy languages have disappeared, but the Pygmy people have not disappeared. And here the Khoisan area has shrunk, and we have to come up with explanations. And population movements, population contacts, language diversification, concurrent with language loss are part of the history of mankind, and I will be returning to that on Wednesday. And this is part of what we learn when we have to deal with language evolution. So for me, there are two kinds, two phases of language evolution. First, the progression from non-language to languages. And second, the first part is called phylogenetic evolution. And then the second part is what we can call as historical evolution. The things that are associated with colonies, empires, kingdoms, and stuff that have produced the diversity of languages that we know today. Okay. And for that, we depend on documentation, written documentation. So part of that historical evolution is really partial because it depends on the groups that left written records. And typically it's the elite class, and we don't know about it. But when it comes to more recent history, we have writings that talk about different populations and so forth, and then we can ask the right questions and try to come up with answers and see if they are satisfactory. Okay. So I'm going to skip this here. Why aren't there any populations that co-opted other physiological alternatives to develop communication technology? Because probably the other alternatives wouldn't work at all. And why aren't there populations that resorted to technology outside the body? And I already talked about that, the transportation cost. Okay. Note that writing is a derivative technology. But even when we focus on writing, we see that the solutions that were adopted are different. They vary. The alphabetical system, the logographic system, the syllabaries, and then you add to it whether you write from left to right or from right to left, or from the top to bottom or from the bottom to the top. You find these patterns of variation too. Okay. So if one considers cave paintings as relevant to understanding the evolution of language, one must ask why it didn't evolve into the dominant technology for communication. I mean, cave paintings. For one thing, you couldn't transport it. Once you're over the wall of the cave, it stays there. These questions raise the following ones. If the emergence of languages was facilitated by the language organ, what is the part of the putative language organ? What is the part that the putative language organ generates? And what is the part that it didn't generate? Okay. And what is the part of cultural evolution? And that is what we are going to discuss tomorrow. What's the relation of language to culture? People often say language and culture. But aren't languages also cultural artifacts? For this, we have to think about what is the meaning of culture. Okay. If you define culture as ways in which members of a population behave toward each other, toward nature, and do things, then language is part of culture. Then we shouldn't be speaking of language and culture, we should be speaking of language in culture. Okay. And did culture ever precede language? No. They all evolve concurrently. On the other hand, one must ask, doesn't cultural evolution presuppose some stage of biological evolution, just as does language itself? Okay. Assuming that language is one of the many cultural phenomena associated with mankind or humankind, doesn't it make more sense to think of the particular mind of a particular mind reflecting a particular brain at a particular evolutionary stage that would have enabled, or facilitated the emergence of language alongside other cultural phenomena? And this is the position that I'm going to defend tomorrow. And it is consistent with thinking of languages as communication technology in a way analogous to the invention of other technologies. And as I try to show, technologies vary in the designs, although they are intended to solve similar problems, if not the same problems. Look at these arrows here. The purpose is to throw an arrow, it hits the animal skin and it immobilizes the animal. But look at the different ways in which the arrows are designed. And some are probably more efficient than others, but they have work and population that survive with different kinds of arrows. When you design arrows, you have to think in terms of aerodynamics, to balance the arrow as it flies. So almost all populations thought of using feathers, but they didn't put the feathers in exactly the same ways. And it works, there's variation. And you have these containers here, and depending if it is metallic or non-metallic, you have designed the handle differently. You have to take into account the material that you use in order to develop these kinds of buckets. If it is wood, you have to do it differently. If it is plastic, you have more latitude. Okay. So, in technology, the same basic idea can be implemented or developed in different ways, focusing on spoken languages. Phonetic inventories needn't be the same from one language to another. Phonological constraints needn't be identical. The only prevailing universal is linearity, and it is imposed by the material used in the technology. We don't have to say it is imposed by the mind. The mind just uses the materials, and but if the man said, let's put different sounds together, you try very hard, but you cannot use the articulators to do this. You would need another kind of material to do that, and we haven't come up with that yet. And what's the purpose of doing it when it is easier? Just to use the sounds in a linear way. And words are usually quite different, but there is a lot of that is why there is arbitrariness. Strategies for establishing reference needn't be the same. They often vary in subtle ways. For instance, regarding the use of the article in French and in English, I cannot use Portuguese here because I don't speak Portuguese. But you say, I like water, right? But in French, you have to say j'aime l'eau with a definite article. Why is there a definite article there? Okay. And in French, you say j'ai des amis, I have friends in English, and French has that indefinite article in the plural, but English doesn't have. So even if on the surface they look like similar typologically, there are subtle ways in which they will still vary, and that is particularly important too. We have to factor that into our musings on the evolution of language. And the order of constituents needn't be the same. The idea of constituents is good. Why? Because if it is linear, and you have to tell one phrase from another phrase, and the phrase is a grouping of terms of items that belong together. If we didn't have this idea of constituents, it would be quite difficult to parse and process a string of words following each other. You have an idea of what particular grouping of words go together and what is the next group of words and so forth, and how and this is part of the hierarchical architecture, how they group together successively into sentences. But recursion here and hierarchical structure is not part of the general architecture of language. It is part of the architecture of utterances. We shouldn't confuse utterances with language itself. And there are principles that we find in utterances which we need to interpret as properties of language. It's, again, from an ecological point of view, is the constraints that the material you are using are imposing so that you may be able to process utterances. In other words, we have to rethink this idea of universal grammar and whether we need a universal grammar in the first place or language program in the first place. The ecology of language evolution, what counts as ecology in hominin phylogeny? The most obvious appear to be the particular anatomical paths used in the production of language. so the differential structure, and the hands, both selected because they are flexible. It is easy to perceive differences between the symbols, okay, and between the components used to produce the symbols. And they are highly generative. In other words, they can produce open-ended inventories of symbols. Okay. And for that, you don't have to increase the number of sounds. You just have to figure out in how many different ways you can combine the sounds. And you'll be surprised there are different combinations that we just avoid. And there are combinations that we prefer, like consonant vowel is a kind of preferred one. You can have consonants, but what kinds of consonants can you have next to each other? And in what position in the structure of the word, and things vary from one language to another. Okay. No less important is the brain, which produces the mind capable of co-opting the relevant anatomical structures. I make a distinction here between brain and mind because, as I usually tell my students, corpses, that is, dead bodies, still have brains, but they have no mind. Okay? And it is so when the brain is working, then the mind is generated, and the mind can solve a lot of problems. So we shouldn't be surprised that if you are looking for a location of language in the brain, you won't find it. Because you have to find the location of language in the mind. And that is where we have to deal with complexity, because the dynamics are very complex. And the parts that are interacting with each other, we have to situate them also in the mind and not in the brain. You are not going to find a part of the brain that is specialized only for phonetics, and a part of the brain that is specialized only for the vocabulary or whatever. Actually, how can you explicate the phonetics from the vocabulary? And in a paper that I published in 2013, Languages Technology, I say syntax started within the word about how to put sounds together to produce words. And then eventually you use words to produce phrases and phrases to produce sentences and so forth. And I don't know whether this linear presentation of things is really the right way. Because you could also say you produce words and then you can identify the different sounds in the word and what are the constraints that regulate how the sounds were put together in that particular word. And there's something, a paper that I'm drafting now, and in which I say the processing of language and the production of utterances is not really linear. When you are thinking what you want to say, you have to be thinking at the same time about the words that you have to use. You have to be thinking at the same time about how to pronounce them and so forth. And it's not like, let me select the words first, and let me select the sounds first, and let me put them into phrases, and then let me put the phrases into sentences. If we had to communicate like this way, we would be very, very slow communicators. Okay. And the alternative is, now a lot of us speak of multitasking, and we have always been multitaskers, doing a lot of things, processing a lot of things, signals in parallel. Differences between sign and spoken languages suggest that the materials used impose physical constraints on how the mind could use them to develop the communicative technology. It's like playing the same song with different instruments. A wind instrument or a string instrument, the song will not sound the same because the instrument is imposing constraints. And I was talking to a musicologist, and she told me that even the voices become a constraint of how you produce music. What kind of throat you have, what kind of voice you have, affect how the song is being sung. Speaking in terms of using phonetic materials imposes linearity more strictly than signing. Signing enables semantic incorporation more successfully than speech. And there is more iconicity in signing than in spoken language. And signing can be lexically more iconic and semantically transparent than speech. So grammar, including phonology, morphology, and syntax, is a consequence of the above constraints imposed by materials used in the communicative technology, or should I say communication technology. Okay. So these are the kinds of things that we have to bear in mind. Focusing on universal grammar in speculations on the phylogenetic emergence of language seems to me like putting the cart before the horse. Conceived of as common or universal properties of languages, universal grammar must be the consequence of how different language technologies have developed. It can't be anterior to them. In other words, similar minds using similar materials to solve similar problems are quite likely to share a lot of properties. The languages they produce are quite likely to share many properties. But even so, more and more people have been talking about implicational universals. In other words, typologically specific universals, rather than across the board universals applying to all languages. That is more and more difficult to prove. There were no languages and therefore no universal grammar specification to talk about before phonetic and manual signs were co-opted to establish explicit and sophisticated communication among members of specific populations. Constraints that have nothing or little to do with the physical aspects of languages may be of the cognitive order, reflecting how the mind works. In other words, there are certain things that are easier for the mind to handle, and some other things that are more difficult. And so that will also explain some of the common properties. And that is what I try to explain with recursion. So you can apply recursion when you work with your furniture kit that you get in a box, and you have to put it together to form a chair or bookshelf or whatever. You have to follow some logic in putting all this together, otherwise you fail. And I will omit various other ecological factors external to hominin anatomy that apply to language history, as they presuppose those that I have discussed here, that bear on the phylogenetic emergence of language and on our ability to learn extant languages with modification. And so when I talk about language endangerment and loss, I involve those other ecological factors that are typically outside the human um, themselves. These others account for the modification of the target language in the formation of idiolects and language change. So one explanation for the existence of idiolect is that our anatomies are not identical. Our perceptions are not of the same quality from one individual to another. The history of our history is interactional histories that shape our idiolects are not identical, even between siblings. And therefore we wind up producing different idiolects. The fact that the siblings were not born together unless they are twins, is already part of the explanation. But even if they were Siamese twins, their perceptions are not identical because they are side by side and may be turning in different directions, and therefore they perceive things differently. And in matters of language vitality, maintenance or loss of languages, we have to involve ecological factors to explain that. Or speciation, the birth of new language varieties such as creoles, we have to involve ecological factors. These are all important aspects of language evolution from a historical perspective. What has exaltation got to do with all this? It is, I'm about to finish. Yeah. Uh, it is everywhere in language evolution. It is in the co-option of the pharyngeal structure and of the hands for developing language technology. What happens is that we already have the ability to use hands and grasp things and so forth. From there, we go to gestures and we go to developing signs. For speech, we already had the capacity for mastication, and we use and the capacity for breathing and the capacity for vocalizations like in other animals, but we domesticated these capacities to for the production of speech. We shouldn't forget the coaction and control of the lungs and breathing as the source of energy and the fundamental mechanism for the production of speech. Assuming that language started with naming, not also that syntax really started with phonology. Compositionality was exacted for forming complex words and sentences and for the production of larger discourse. One can reinterpret duality of patterning to capture this recursive application of the same principle. You exact something that exists already to produce something else. And that is one way of handling, of managing the reality. In this sense, syntax makes language generative. And what we do here is that instead of memorizing everything, we identify patterns and we apply those patterns to grouping of of different units, and then we can produce these complex sentences. If you are a minimalist, I think this is an interpretation that should make sense to you. There is a certain amount of exaltation in the way syntax, in the narrow traditional sense, evolved consistently with emergentism. The process seems to have been set in motion with predication. Predication, you use like a verb to say something about the subject in the kinds of languages that we speak here. When some words not only name activities or conditions, but also specified relations between arguments. And we make that distinction between words that are used as predicates and words that are used as arguments. subject, object, or whatever. And arguments evolve from being only nominal to also closer and sentential. So embedded clauses, they are kind of nouns that are made up of sentences, but sentences that function as nouns. And in some languages, such as Japanese, an embedded clause must be ending with a nominalizing suffix that tells you this part is functioning as a noun. And when we put things in perspective, that's why we have complementizers. They tell us what follow is an argument in this kind of complex sentence or composite sentence. Okay. And if students of grammaticalization have it right, some secondary predicates have produced prepositions to specify grammatical relations and inflections. So you find this in English, for instance, beside the preposition beside equal from by the side of, inside in the side, outside out of the side of, and things like that. You can come up with, if you check in a good dictionary, you will find the etymologies of all these prepositions and figure out how they couldn't evolve from nouns and from the syntax that goes with these nouns. The full story of evolution from proto-language or primordial languages to modern languages is still to be worked out, but exaptation plays an important role in the way things differ because you don't want to start all over and design things. You want to adapt principles that work already, and by the principle of generativity, you come up with these new structures and so forth. Okay. So, the protracted evolution of language appears to be a problem-solving journey in which the mind has been the driver, co-opting hominin anatomy to produce proto-language and tinkering with all the structures and principles to expand the emergence technology. And the problem to solve has been for each community how to develop rich, adequate communication for increasingly complex cognition. And it's a quite serious ecological pressure. And what makes us uniquely human in the animal kingdom, when you think about it, is not language, the way that we have been trained. It's the mind. That in the animal kingdom, we have been endowed with a mental capacity that is capable of solving several problems in so many different ways and of generating rich cultures that are different from the cultures of other animals. Okay. So, this is how we represent language, and why syntax is not only syntax but prosodic features. Let's eat grammar versus let's eat grammar. Okay, so otherwise, gracias, thank you, obrigado.
So, questions, comments? Let's see.
So I finished right on time.
Yes.
Okay, maybe you'll ask me questions tomorrow because I'll be coming back with some of this. Tomorrow I will be sure. I mean my communication, my presentation will be sure. See how imprecise language can be? I told you I'll be sure. It's like I'm going to swim.
I may have a question.
Yeah.
So, do you think we could have the sign language really heard in humankind, in mankind, and would we have some trace of it?
If we had only a sign language,
Yes.
we would have been able to do the same kinds of things, but with the shortcoming that if you are using your hands to do something manual, you cannot at the same time sign. So you will have to do the work first, the manual work, and then sign, or sign first and do the manual work. But otherwise, in terms of thinking and so forth, we will just be as efficient as thinkers. And the reason is the language of thought is independent of the language of communication. So there's usually translation from what we think in whatever language it is we don't know, and translate it into the physical languages that we have invented.
So thank you. Thank you for being here today. Tomorrow will be our last day. And we have to finish today a little early because you use the room. So thank you all. See you tomorrow.